What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to DeepRockGalactic for our weekly Elite Deep Dive guide, where I go through all of the details and parameters and help you get through this week's Elite Deep Dive just a little bit better. So let's just get right into the video and talk about this week's Elite Deep Dive, Infernal Base. So first, talking about the basic details of this particular Elite Deep Dive this week. Starters, the biome it takes place on is the Hollow Bow, which is one that can sometimes be a little bit problematic, although thankfully in this case, with the generations of the caves this week, it's really not too bad. The only real thing you have to worry about are the stabber vines, and thankfully there aren't too many that you need to be super aware of. There's one that shows up in the very beginning of the first stage of the dive, but other than that, throughout the course of the whole entire dive, we really didn't come across that many stabber vines, or at least none that were very problematic. So thankfully, in terms of biome, there's not really a whole lot of hazards that are going to be in your way directly. Then if you also want to get optimal with the drink from the Abyss Bar, of course, Red Rock Blaster would be a phenomenal choice. And since there's going to be a lot of digging, Rocky Mountain wouldn't be a bad choice either, or Slayer Stout if you just want to be able to power attack as much as humanly possible. Then talking about the individual stages that you're going to be going through for this particular deep dive. In stage 1, first you have a egg hunt mission where you have to collect 4 eggs, and you also have to find 2 resonance crystals with the Swarmageddon warning active on this particular stage. In stage 2, you have a deep scan in which you have to find 3 resonance crystals, and you also have to do a black box. And there will also be the Cave Leech cluster warning active as well. And then finally for stage 3, it is a point extraction mission where you have to find 7 aquaric gems and also collect 150 morkite on the side, with the addition of the parasites warning. So as you can see, this particular Elite Deep Dive has a lot of different moving parts. There is a good mix of mission types and objectives where you are going to have to be stationary and defend, and others where you have to go around and find stuff, with more of a focus on you finding things. And in terms of the warnings, there are going to be a lot of small things coming at you with things like Swarmageddon and Parasite and even Cave Leech Cluster to a degree. So things that have the ability to take out a lot of small threats very quickly are going to be the best bets that you want to bring. Now going into the actual cave generation for the caves for this particular Elite Deep Dive. Starting off with stage 1, it was actually a pretty small overall room setup. There wasn't a crazy amount of branching pathways, and thankfully it stayed relatively circled in on itself. When it comes to finding the resonance crystals, there's one actually right next to the spawn room, so it's quite easy to find, and the other one is not too far away from spawn. So if you're looking for the resonance crystals and having a hard time, stay close to where the drop pod first landed and you should be able to find them pretty quickly. When it comes to gathering the eggs, thankfully all of them are pretty well grouped together. There is one that is kind of out on its own up towards a higher part of the caves that you may have to find, but other than that, they are all relatively close to each other. And again, keep in mind that since you are gathering 4 eggs, you are going to have to be prepared for at least one very big swarm to come at you. Then talking about stage 2, it is a very vertical and windy layout as you would expect for a deep scan. Thankfully, it's not too complicated and you should be able to find the crystals relatively easy. Again, since you only have to find 3 of them, it's not too bad. The black box again is situated right next to spawn, which is actually pretty good, and it is actually in a very good defendable position, especially if you have a competent engineer, which I'll get into a little bit more when I talk about actual class loadouts and strategies. But just keep in mind that the black box is in a very good spot for this particular stage. Also, again, this might be a little bit more anecdotal because this was just how things happened on our dive, but we had a lot of stingtails on this particular stage. I don't know why, they just appeared incredibly often on this particular stage, so keep that in the back of your mind. Again, that's kind of anecdotal. You might have different enemies spawn than we did, but just be aware. And finally, on stage 3, since it is a point extraction mission, it is on a very open room. And in typical point extraction fashion, when you first start off the mission, you are greeted by a ton of enemies that are going to want to welcome you. Be very careful at this particular point because, again, since it's the final stage of the dive, these enemies are going to be very tough, and there is a lot that is going to greet you. We had some Brood Nexus, there were a couple Spitballers, a lot of Spitters, just a lot of things initially that are going to hit you the moment you step out of the drop pod. Thankfully though, once you do get past that initial wave of enemies, you see that it is just basically a very big open room similar to other point extraction missions. And for the most part, the aquaric gems are not too difficult to find and the morkite is very easy to find. There is, however, a hidden room sort of up in a very far pathway that is a little bit off center from where the main room is, that has several other aquaric gems that you will probably have to go to. At least that's how it was for us, because we could not get enough aquaric gems with the ones that were in the main central area, so we had to go there. And there were several spitball enemies that were waiting for us, so keep that in mind and be very careful when you do go up there. And again, the Morkite is very easy to find as it is littered all throughout the cave system. So now going into class loadouts and setups. For this particular elite deep dive, I went through it with Scout, and unfortunately, again this week, I have a bad habit of one of our teammates disconnecting halfway through the first stage, so we had to go through most of it with 3 people, so our gunner was not super present throughout the majority of the dive, but we still managed to get through it pretty well. Talking about perks, at least a very standard common setup that I like to use for most of my builds is present here. Passive perks, I'm running Resupplier, Born Ready, and Thorns. Thorns you could probably swap out for something like Sweet Tooth, but I wanted to have something to sort of help offset the amount of swarmers and parasites that are going to be coming after us. Especially once you get to the later stage, it kind of falls off, so probably something more like Sweet Tooth or Vampire would help. And again, active perks, I'm using Dash and Iron Will because it's just way too good. By the way, before we go on, if you're liking this video, be sure to subscribe. And if you want a chance to catch my videos early, consider becoming a member today as you get early membership access to all of my videos. It would really help me out a lot, and I truly appreciate any and all support that you may give. So then talking about actual loadouts, again, I decided to go through with Scout for this particular week, and I decided to do something to sort of help out the rest of my teammates because I knew that they were going to be doing something elemental focused. So I went with a Conductive Thermals Drac Carbine build with the Jumbo Shells Boomstick, and it worked out pretty well. I was able to debuff and slow down essentially everything, and the boomstick was a great tool for taking out those bigger, tougher threats. And for grenade choice, you can pretty much run whatever you want, and that's kind of true for every one of the classes this week. There's not really any sort of specifics in terms of ways that each individual grenade could help out a little bit more, so really you can use whichever one you want. And again, this build worked out very well because my driller was running a cryo build, and initially the gunner was running a sort of burning hell lead storm build, but again, he didn't really get a chance to utilize it a whole lot because he disconnected halfway through the first stage. And then talking about some tips for each individual stage, for the Scout specifically, there are a lot of ways that he can help with this particular dive because there's a lot of mobility, there's a lot of finding stuff, and this is very well suited for the Scout. For stage 1, going around finding the eggs or finding the crystal locations is very easy for him. So if you're able to zip around and find the locations very quickly, that way your team has little downtime as possible, that would be very useful. Again, just make sure you pace the eggs, that way you make sure your teammates are well aware that there is going to be a swarm coming. And then don't forget to gather Nitra as you go through each individual stage. For stage 2, again, it's very similar. You just kind of want to try to find as much resources as you possibly can. Try to make sure that you have as much Nitra as possible, that way your teammates are well stocked up. When it comes to finding the crystals, there are a couple that are pretty easy to find, but in some cases you might have to have your teammates help out a little bit, especially since again it's a deep scan cave, so they can be very winding and confusing. And then for stage 3, this is probably where you're going to shine the most because you can very quickly and easily gather the acquired gems. I think this stage actually took us the least amount of time just because we were very quick and efficient with finding the acquired gems until we had to hunt for the last one, which again is in that hidden room that I told you about. But this is very well suited for the Scout as he's able to get the acquired gems, he's able to get the Morkite, and since it's the final stage, you really don't need to worry too much about Nitra if you have been good with gathering it the past few stages. Then talking about the other classes, first for the driller, our driller was running a very strong cryo build, as is pretty much always a good idea to bring for elite deep dives. It's a little bit basic and it's simple, but it's just way too effective not to bring. Something very simple like a tuned cooler cryo cannon with the wave cooker is a great choice, especially when comboed with the conductive thermals that I was providing for everybody. And then talking about stage tips, for the most part throughout all of the stages as the driller, you just want to make good pathways for everybody to follow. In the first stage, you are essentially just trying to make the best holdout points possible, as well as go from one egg to the next very easily. In stage 2, again, since it's a deep scan, you have a very good ability to make short pathways between the resonance crystals and to help your teammates find them, since again, the caves can be very winding. And during the actual descent of the deep scan itself, you have a lot of crowd control with your cryo cannon and just your sheer area damage. And then finally in stage 3, again, since it's a much bigger, more open area, you might want to focus on just getting the resources that you can easily get to towards the ground, and then leave the higher, more difficult to reach resources to your Scout, that way he can get them much easier. And talking about setups for the engineer, for our particular case, our engineer was running a very solid setup with the explosive chemical round smart rifle and a return to sender breach cutter, which kind of caught me off guard, but it actually worked out very well. He had very strong area control and good single target takedowns, and was able to handle pretty much any situation he needed. And then going through some stage tips, there is a decent amount of defensive capabilities throughout the course of this entire dive, with again going down the deep scan caves, and then also just holding out during the point extraction mission, since you are going to be getting constant swarms throughout the course of the entire mission, as well as just a lot of small fodder enemies coming at you with things like Swarmageddon and Parasites active, so the engineer does have a lot of value throughout the course of the whole dive. In the first stage, I would say just make sure that you have the proper platforms up to allow your teammates, specifically your Scouts, scout to get to the valuable resources and positions that he needs to be in, and then set up a good defensive foothold for when the egg swarm inevitably happens. And in the second stage, again, you want to set up for the black box defense very well. And a special thing that you can do with this particular stage is, as I said earlier, the black box is in a very good defendable position because it is in a spot that there are only two ways that the bugs can actually come at you from unless they spawn in the room. And if you are the engineer, you can actually block off one of the pathways. In our case, the engineer blocked off the pathway to the right because it was a little bit easier. And in which case that makes it so that way the enemies can only come at you from one side, which made it very easy to defend during the actual black box section. And then during the actual drill elevator section, again, just make sure that you are being as defensive as you can and taking out as much enemies as possible. And finally, in stage 3, again, you kind of want to play a little bit more defensively because you want to make sure that you keep the central hub platform a good fallback spot for your allies to go to, and then also making sure that you set up platforms for your scout to be able to get to the aquaric gems, the nitra, the morkite, whatever he needs to get to. And finally, talking about the gunner, again, since our gunner disconnected halfway through the first stage, it was kind of hard to see exactly what he was doing, but given the circumstances and giving the actual stage details and what this deep dive consists of, a very good crowd control and just swarm elimination build would probably be very good. Something very good like a rotary overdrive lead storm build with maybe a hellfire coil gun would work wonders because it would allow you to have good consistent damage output as well as strong burst damage whenever you need to, which would help out immensely when handling those swarmers that are going to be around you, or even those bigger threats like Praetorians when they do sneak up. And talking about stage tips for the first stage, again, you are probably going to be primarily just focused on handling the swarms when they do come up, as well as giving your teammates defense whenever they need it, using your zip lines to help your allies get to good advantage points and angles, and allowing them to get the eggs that they might not be able to reach immediately. In stage 2, again, you kind of want to just stick with your allies and protect them as much as you can, helping to set up the resonance scanners, and then also when the black box defense starts, just be the offensive front line that your teammates need you to be in calling the enemy swarms, and the same thing kind of applies to when you are going down the drill elevator section. And finally, in stage 3, again, you just kind of want to sit there and be effective against the swarms that are going to inevitably come at you. Since it is a point extraction mission and these swarms are going to essentially be constantly coming at you once you get to a certain point, you want to be as fast as you possibly can in order to avoid the inevitable hordes of enemies that are going to be coming at you. So overall, this elite deep dive was actually not too bad, and you can actually get it done pretty quickly if you and your team are fast enough. The last stage in particular, because it's a point extraction mission and you can speed run those very effectively, you can actually get through this entire dive very quickly. The only one that might take a little while is the second stage, just because you have to go through the drill elevator section. But other than that, you can actually get through the whole dive pretty quickly, and it's also not too bad. You just need to be careful of the smaller enemies that can swarm you very easily, such as the swarmers, the parasites, and the cave leeches. I did mention this, weren't really that much of a factor. I didn't actually even see any. I'm not sure if my allies got a hold of them and they just got rid of them before I even had the chance to see them, but the cave leech clusters, it's kind of a non-factor for this particular elite deep dive. Overall, it's not too difficult, and if you have good team composition, you should be able to get through this particular dive very easily. Anyway, I hope you guys found this deep dive guide helpful. If you did, please be sure to let me know by hitting that like button and consider becoming a member and subscribing today, as it really helps me out a lot. Rock and Stone Miners, I'll see you in the next video.